Well, it's an absolute delight for me to be here with you here in Druskininkai. It's my second visit to Lithuania. I came in December of 2022, thanks to Karis, and thanks to Žilvinas, and thank you to Laura for you all collectively for the invite and the work on this conference. It really is, it's a fantastic privilege to be here. So it's my second time. My own Chilionis journey, I would say it's not just beginning, it's been going on for the last couple of years, thanks largely to Karis. And I'm absolutely delighted to be involved in an advisory capacity on the complete edition work that was being mentioned by Karis earlier. So a couple of, I would say, customary apologies, but they're not actually customary and they're not typical apologies. The first is that I apologise for not talking about Chilionis. In spite of my journey having begun, it's not remotely at the stage where I can talk about him in an academic capacity. So I apologise for that. And I also have to say that the word beyond in my title, Mozart, the Pyramids and Beyond, has to do quite a lot of work as well in the context of what I'm talking about. I'm looking at an Egyptianized version of Mozart's Die Zauberflöte, then the Magic Flute, and it's for France in 1801. The Egyptian context then is very important, as I'll show, but this certainly isn't my only point of focus. I move off in various other different directions, which I hope you will indulge me in that respect, and I hope it will be enlightening in one way or another. Just to say then that I'll refer to Die Zauberflöte, the German title for the Magic Flute, or the Magic Flute, or La Flûte Enchantée, then the Magic Flute in French, and these are all references to the original Mozart opera. My PowerPoint, which I hope you can all see, including those at the back, is fairly minimal. It'll present a summary of my arguments, which I know that translators are translating my text anyway, but I hope it will help for you to have that as well. Great. Okay, now I'll talk for about 45 minutes, which I hope is not extending my welcome. On the 20th of August 1801, a version of Die Zauberflöte titled Les Mystères d'Isis, Mysteries of Isis, premiered at the Paris Opéra to a French libretto by Etienne Morel de Chedeville and music arranged and adapted by the Bohemian musician Ludwig Wenzel Nachnith. The new libretto followed the trajectory of Mozart's plot, but made significant alterations in tone, content, and orientation. The music reordered and adapted numbers from Die Zauberflöte, excluding some entirely, as well as several from Le Nozze di Figaro, Don Giovanni, La Clemenza di Tito, and a brief segment from Haydn's Symphony No. 103, surprisingly, and it incorporated new recitatives by Nachnith. Like Die Zauberflöte, which took German-speaking Europe by storm in the 1790s, Les Mystères d'Isis enjoyed stupendous popular success, in contrast to earlier Parisian adaptations of Mozart's Figaro in 1793 and Die Entführung aus dem Seraglio, abduction from the Seraglio, in 1798. It was performed almost 130 times between 1801 and 1827, and more than any other work at the opera in the first decade of the 19th century. According to the Journal du Soir, soon after the premiere, quote, to undertake to convey into the souls of simple listeners the enthusiasm which the opera excited in the spectators would be impossible, unquote. Crowds were prodigious, and the auditorium was packed. The success of the work was said to have accrued with every performance. The Théâtre du Marais in Paris staged a parody, Les Mystères d'Isis, the Mysteries of Izzy, whoever she is, in late September 1801, only 1 month after the opera's premiere, both evidencing and exploiting its early popular success. And the enthusiasm for Les Mystères did not diminish in the ensuing years either. It was, quote, almost as successful in Paris as the Magic Flute was here, unquote, which was words of one Prussian Kapellmeister in 1805 after direct experience of performances in Paris. Around 20 editions of extracts from La Flûte Enchantée appeared in Paris between 1793 and 1800, but these are dwarfed in number by publications under the title Les Mystères d'Isis in the early decades of the 19th century. Arrangements amply attest to the active engagement with the opera in domestic and public music settings in the 1800s, 1810s, and 1820s. They include arrangements for solo instruments, piano, guitar, flute, and a wide range of instrumental combinations. Now, set against the public popularity of Les Mystères is its dismal, absolutely dismal, critical reception and marginalization in the last 200 years or so. Few, if any, works by or directly associated with Mozart have suffered the relentless, unremitting critical opprobrium meted out to Les Mystères by distinguished writers. Just to give you some examples. Sigismund von Neukomm, who's a Salzburg native, a pupil of Mozart, and prominent 19th century Mozart promoter in Austria and abroad, could hardly believe what Lachneath had done, mutilating, he believed, almost every number from Die Zauberflöte. Louis Spohr, the famous composer, in a letter from Paris in 1820, condemned the changes to Mozart's music, the inclusion of material not from Die Zauberflöte, and the substitution of serious texts for the light-hearted and comical ones in the original. Hector Berlioz, 1836, unleashed a famously and stingingly indignant sarcastic attack, quote, on the whole lamentable concoction from criminals who assassinated Mozart, unquote. So the language here, you're beginning to get a sense of what the issues are here. Alexander Ulybyshev, 1843, and Otto Jahn, 1856 to 59, issued a panoply of objections in their famous Mozart mid-19th century biographies, including about the changes to the identities of individual characters, distortions and omissions in Mozart's music, and the eradication of comedic elements of text and plot. Other 19th century writers dismissed it more bluntly as a monstrous pastiche, a monstrous compilation, and an abominable compilation. For J.S. Shedlock, Les Mystères even constituted, I kid you not, quote, probably the worst crime ever committed, unquote, whether that's in music or outside of music, I suppose. Reception has not improved since 1900 either. For J.G. Prudhomme in 1919, it was a monstrous pasticcio, and Hermann Arbeit, famous Mozart biographer from around 1920, quote, the most insane chapter in the work Magic Flute's history. Rarely, if ever, can a work of art have ever been treated with such contempt. For Winton Dean, this is moving forward to 1982, this, quote, notorious arrangement and travesty is an example of the impoverished artistic integrity circa 1800 in Paris under Napoleon, unquote, come back to Napoleon later. Peter Branscombe, 1991, barely concealed his disdain for Les Mystères in a famous book on Magic Flute. This French perversion, he said, was a stylistic disaster coming close to the world of intentional parody. While several of Les Mystères' detractors, such as Berlioz, Jahn, Dean, and Branscombe, acknowledged the great popularity of the opera in the first quarter of the 19th century, they attempt neither to explain and contextualize the popularity, nor to understand it in relation to the subsequent critical mood, greatly negative, as I say. Spohr expressed bafflement that the French, quote, had always highly disapproved of this vandalic mutilation of a great masterpiece, unquote, but had let it remain in the repertory for almost 20 years, especially when the public, as Spohr said, as I see it every day, rules so despotically in the theatre and manage to have everything their own way, unquote. Now, deliberately, obtusely, or not, Spohr misleadingly allied at public and critical opinion. Berlioz, in contrast, was exasperated at the public not holding the likes of Lachneath, the musical adapter, to account. Quote, no one came forward to treat these criminals as they deserved, or at least to expose their crimes. Alas, what if anyone had? The public is little troubled by such things, not only in France, but in Germany, England, and elsewhere. The greatest works of all kinds are suffered to be adapted, which means smirched and abused by any non-entity, unquote. It's rare, I should stress this, it's rare in Mozart's world to encounter a chasm between public and critical opinions of a work, even when Mozart's world is stretched to include a project like Les Mystères. In an attempt to understand the dramatically diverging views inspired by Les Mystères, it's time, I think, to dial down the rhetoric on it, much of which ungenerously impugns the moral conduct of Morel and Lachneath, as we've already seen, with talk of criminality and so on. After all, Les Mystères is only one among many late 18th and early 19th century adaptations of Die Zauberflöte. Even in 1794, 7 years before the premiere of Les Mystères, the Journal des Luxus und den Moden complained that no opera had been, quote, produced, shaped, trimmed, used and abused, edited, modelled, parodied, imitated and corrupted in such innumerable ways as Mozart's Zauberflöte in Germany. So that's 1794. We also need to reopen the files on Les Mystères and revisit understandings of it because of its important position in the history of French reception of Mozart's music and therefore Mozart's reception more broadly. In order properly to do so, we need first to contextualize more thoroughly than hitherto the opera's musical, historical and cultural environments, including Morel's and Lachnit's involvement, the political atmosphere in Napoleonic France circa 1800, the identity and ontology of the work itself, and of course, the opera's explicitly Egyptian setting. Okay, Les Mystères d'Isis in context. Okay, Morel's and Lachnit's interests, experiences, and orientations prior to 1801 help inform discussion of Les Mystères. As early as 1783, under the Ancien Regime, of course, before the French Revolution, Morel, a key administrative and artistic figure at the turn of the century, opéra, penned the libretto for an opera set in Egypt by André Grétry, famous French composer, La Caravane du Caire, the Cairo Caravan. This was an important work in the history of the Paris Opera. As Grétry explained, quote, "I saw the public tired of endless tragedies, and in La Caravane, more than any of my other operas of the time, determined public opinion on the need to establish lyric comedy at this theatre, the Opera," unquote, which is the most prestigious Parisian venue in, well, indeed, in all of France and probably in Europe at that time. The work, this is Caravan du Cairo, which is credited above all for its novelty of plot, thus initiated a new epoch at France's most prestigious opera venue. Shortly after his death, too, Morel received historical credit in this area of endeavour. Quote, "It was he who introduced onto the lyrical stage, or who at least supported there, a cheerful and graceful genre," unquote. La Caravane was an exceedingly popular work, receiving 506 performances and many revivals, including one in 1800, shortly before the premiere of Les Mystères. Moreover, not only is it set in Egypt, like Les Mystères, but the plot also bears a striking resemblance to that of Mozart's Die Entführung aus dem Seraglio, the abduction from the Seraglio. While Morel presumably did not know Mozart's Entführung in 1782 when writing his own libretto for La Caravane, he would have familiarized himself with it when produced in Paris in 1798. In short, a combination of location and plot-related circumstances relating to the success of his earlier opera, La Caravane, provided Morel with insight into how Mozart's music, as yet mostly unfamiliar in France, could be well positioned for impact on the stage of the opera. Like Morel, Lachnit was familiar with Mozart's music before working on Les Mystères for the opera. In 1798, he jointly authored with Louis Adam a piano fingering method that included Mozart passages. More importantly, he worked for around 2 years in the 1790s on an ultimately unperformed version of Die Zauberflöte for the Théâtre Feydeau in Paris, as documented in a letter from November 1801. An almost complete extant manuscript of La Flûte Enchantée in 2 volumes, with some text missing, apparently contains Lachnit's hand. Lachnit was already an experienced music arranger before Les Mystères, including of Haydn's and Pleyel's music. He was also, like Morel, well connected at the opera as one of 3 shortlisted candidates in 1800, albeit an unsuccessful one, for the position of deputy conductor of the opera under Jean-Baptiste Rey. Thus, Morel and Lachnit each had a considerable amount invested in making Les Mystères a popular success. On the one hand, Morel, a mainstay of the opera, who will have known that spectacular and lavish productions would have been expected at this most august of venues, had a reputation to uphold, and directly or indirectly, the finances of this august institution to consider. Lachnit, on the other hand, had something to prove after failing to obtain the conducting role at the opera, and with a lengthy period of work on an unperformed Die Zauberflöte behind him. Lachnit was certainly possessive of Les Mystères, asserting a belief about his full authorial rights over it, and consequently an entitlement to substantial compensation from it, especially given the difficulties, he tells us, of adapting Mozart's Zauberflöte to suit the opera. In the aforementioned letter of November 1801, he explained to the director of the opera, Jacques Célérier, that he deserved the 300 francs per performance mandated to other composers at the opera, and would have tried his luck at the opera, with his opera at the Théâtre Feydeau had he thought this amount were not forthcoming to him at the opera. The path to a successful production of Les Mystères would have been a narrow and intricate one, though, in the political climate of the French consulate. So that's 1799 to 1804, and this is Napoleon, of course. Napoleon himself kept a close eye on opera, believing that it, quote, had a special power to inspire subjects with patriotic sentiments in his cause, but also represented a potential threat as a medium for whipping up hostile feelings towards him, unquote. That's from James Johnson in a book from the 1990s. Napoleon was a famous chameleon among his own subjects and others at the turn of the 19th century, with an uncanny knack of changing colour to suit and dominate specific groups. And he met a shrewd political operator in Morel, who was commended in an official diktat from 1802 as a talented and experienced Director General of the Opera, who had, quote, a very deep knowledge of the administration of opera in all its parts, unquote. Moreover, in this diktat, it was believed that the opera would continue, quote, to redouble their efforts to merit the benevolence of the government and to fulfill the just hopes of the public, unquote. If Napoleon, as James Johnson points out, quote, had a clear vision of the audience he wanted at the opera, orderly, fashionable, and above all, in unified adoration of His Majesty, in other words, Napoleon himself, unquote, and also required pomp and patriotism at a work's core, then this is what Morel would have felt it obligatory to provide in Les Mystères. Napoleon, by the way, attended an early performance of Les Mystères in autumn 1801. Like the original Zauberflöte, politicized in a pro-Jacobin interpretation in the wake of the French Revolution in the mid-1790s, Les Mystères was also understood to have expressed specific political sentiments. The clearest political dimension to Les Mystères is its Egyptian location and subject matter, coinciding as it does with Napoleon's Egyptian campaign, which is from 1798 to 1801. While Les Mystères does not invoke Napoleon specifically, the association between the glories of ancient Egypt and those of Napoleonic France would have been lost on no one. Vivant Denon's dedication to Napoleon in a book about the Egyptian campaign from 1802 alerts us to the requirements of authors and artists at that time. Quoting Denon, this is the dedication to Napoleon in his book, quote, "To combine the lustre of your name with the splendour of the monuments of Egypt is to associate the glorious annals of our time with the history of the heroic age," unquote. French interest in Egypt throughout the 18th century is evidenced, for example, in Egyptian-themed operas such as La Caravane de Caire that I mentioned, an article from Voltaire in 1756 on the Egyptian mysteries, and an entry on music in ancient Egyptian culture in the Encyclopédie Méthodique from 1791. Interest, though, in Egypt reached fever pitch in a Napoleonic context at the turn of the century. The quantity and range of books published or made available in France in the run-up to the premiere of Les Mystères in 1801 documents French Egyptomania, if you like, on voyages to and memories of Egypt, in journals focused on Egypt, and in collections of letters to and from the country, and in politically motivated studies, of course, including descriptions of military activities. And Egyptian art and imagery was a source of great fascination too, including obelisks, sphinxes, and pyramids. Just to give you a little flavour of that, a couple of images here. This is some sort of fabric, I think there were quite clearly pyramids and camels and obelisks and everything all around from around about 1800. I could have picked any number of examples here. Just remarkable amount of Egyptian imagery being circulated at that time. And here's another one here with a kind of avenue of sphinxes, which actually is quite interesting because there's Les Mystères has a scene quite similar to that, which I'll come on to in a moment. So again, as I say, Egyptian iconography is absolutely everywhere. Considerable attention is also given to the mysteries of Isis themselves and their ancient religious initiation rites in the cult of the Egyptian goddess Isis at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th, sometimes emphasizing links to Freemasonry. Morel used one well-known, frequently reissued source in particular, Étienne François de Lantier's Antenor's Voyages in Greece and Asia with Ideas about Egypt, which was first published in 1798, with its extended discussion of initiation rites, celebrations, processions, the state of the underworld, and emblems of the mysteries of Isis. It provided Morel with very useful information, probably than you needed, about ancient Egyptian myth and legend. At least 2 reviews of Les Mystères in La Décade philosophique and the Gazette Nationale soon after the premiere also made connections between the trials depicted by Lantier in this book and Morel. To be sure, the original Zauberflöte has a prominent Egyptian dimension. Abbé Jean Terrasson's French novel, Sethos, His History or Life Taken from the Monuments and Anecdotes of Ancient Egypt, 1731, was a source for Schikaneder, it's mentioned here on my PowerPoint. Prayers are made in Zauberflöte to Isis and Osiris, the mysteries of Isis are mentioned, the pyramids feature in stage directions, and the original published libretto of Zauberflöte includes a picture of an obelisk with hieroglyphics. In addition, the opera was referred to around the time of its premiere as Die Egyptische Geheimnisse, the Egyptian secrets, including by Johann Jakob Heibel, who was a singer at Schikaneder's Wiener Theater, where Die Zauberflöte was first performed. But Die Zauberflöte is not located in a culturally specific setting, either in Egypt or anywhere else, and it features an eclectic rather than a uniform exoticism. Indeed, for Matthew Head, writing recently in the Cambridge Companion to the Magic Flute, quote, the opera unfolds in a place of the imagination, says Zauberflöte. If it can be located at all, it might be thought of as a picturesque parkland. These were fashionable at the time and often adorned with rocks, temples, grottos, and even pyramids that appear in the opera, or even the make-believe exotic landscape of an oriental fairy tale, unquote. That's what Matthew Head says, and I would agree with that. The location of Les Mystères in Egypt specifically is confirmed unambiguously right at the beginning of the opera in one of the most significant dramatic and structural adjustments to Die Zauberflöte. Instead of having Tamino, lead character in Die Zauberflöte, appear in a Japanese hunting costume, by the way, in a rocky scene of uncertain location after the overture, Morel in Les Mystères moves straight to a scene with Zarastro and his priests in Egypt, explaining in the libretto, and you have this quote up here on the PowerPoint, quote, the theatre represents the porticos that surround the enclosure inhabited by the priests of Isis. We see on one side the entrance to the Paris of Mylène, on the other that of the underground, which leads to the residence of the priests and at the temple of Isis. Further away, a bridge over a canal of the Nile. We discover in the background various pyramids, and in the distance the view of Memphis, the ancient capital of Egypt, of course. At sunrise, the priests and priestesses are lined up in the theatre where they wait for the time assigned for offering a sacrifice to Isis. It is night. Okay, so we think this is a sketch actually for the first scene. It's somewhat different to the description that I've just given you, but you can see obviously a bridge over the Nile. There you can see a city in the distance, which is clearly Memphis, these porticos with the sphinxes on the top, etc. Probably the priest's residence here on the right, on the left. Difficult to know, it's incomplete, as you can see, as that big kind of silhouette thing in the middle indicates. But this is almost certainly a sketch for the first scene then of Les Mystères. Okay, in spite of the huge liberties taken by Morel and Lachneath with Mozart's and Schikaneder's original, this first scene is the only instance in Les Mystères of music from Die Zauberflöte migrating from the second to the first half of the opera, or indeed from the first half to the second half. Die Zauberflöte, by the way, is in 2 acts, and Les Mystères is in 4. With Zarastro announcing in this first scene the trials and initiation of the heroic Ismenor, Tamino, from Die Zauberflöte, as well as Pamino being intended for him, the plot immediately focuses, which in Zauberflöte only emerges later, the plot immediately focuses on Ismenor's journey ahead, thereby simplifying the original narrative, downplaying its magical component in particular, as many critics have noted. The scene is just, this is the first scene, is just as important though as the first illustration of the Egyptianization of the opera. This includes name changes for several characters, you've got them up here, Tamino, becomes Ismenor, Papageno becomes Bacoris, the Queen of the Night becomes Myrène, the three ladies become the three women from Myrène. The replacement of the magic flute is also something that happens with an Egyptian sistrum. I've given you an illustration here of the Egyptian sistrum, so no magic flute specifically. And also there's the appearance of ostentatious Egyptian iconography on stage, as I've mentioned, and as we can also see in Act 2. So a quotation here from Morel's libretto again, this is for Act 2. Quote, "The theatre changes and represents a vast avenue of sphinxes that lead from the habitation of the profane to the temple and to the place reserved for the residence of the priests. We discover terraces on which are plantations that surround these monuments," unquote. Now, we've got something again that we suspect, again, is a stage design for the second act of Les Mystères, which I've just put up on the board. You can see the sphinxes either side there, the kind of avenue leading possibly into the residence of the priests. So again, it's certainly something from Les Mystères. We can't be absolutely certain it's for the second act, but it would certainly seem that way. Okay, so both stage sets for Acts 1 and 2 attracted contemporary praise. According to the Courrier des Spectacles, on the 22nd of August 1801, 2 days after the premiere, quote, "The first colours that daylight brings into a vast building in Act 1 have been imitated and graduated with great intelligence. These gradations were produced by the blue glasses placed on the lamps, frames then partially removed, and replaced by wine glasses. The Allée des Sphinx, what I was just mentioning here, also received special commendation in the Courrier des Spectacles. For the journal, the Petite Affiche, quote, "The Sphinx gallery in the second act is of great effect and proves that we were right to observe repeatedly that oblique points will always succeed for the optics and perspective of the theatre," unquote. As we shall see below, the decor produced by Ignazio de Gotti for the Les Mystères production consistently received high praise in the early reception of Les Mystères. Thus, from the start, Les Mystères represented a juggling act for Morel and Lachnith. They needed simultaneously to demonstrate a political orientation pleasing to the Napoleonic regime, to meet the expectations of the opera, including for a lavish production, and to introduce their French audiences to a composer, Mozart, with whom they were not yet very familiar. Even the inclusion of other numbers from Mozart's opera, which is certainly strange to later ears, has a certain logic to it when the necessity for an operatic hit in complex circumstances trumped the need for anything resembling fidelity to Mozart. And the appearance of numbers from the opera seria La Clemenza di Tito in both halves of the opera, with Don Giovanni and Figaro confined to the first and second acts respectively, lends an additional air of gravity to a new opera shorn of most of the humour of Die Zauberflöte, very little humour in Les Mystères d'Isis. The combination of a simplified plot and a specific location for events on the one hand, and a complicated score with numbers altered, added and excluded on the other, is a product then of a unique set of artistic and cultural conditions. Okay, the early reception of Les Mystères d'Isis. French critical opinion of Les Mystères in the first decade of the 19th century was in most respects, very positive. Like the original Zauberflöte, the libretto and subject matter of Les Mystères received a mixed reception. The weak plot could have been better planned, it was said, and contained no situations of interest. The music, though, had a smoother ride early on, with Lachnith's adaptations apparently not affecting judgments, perhaps because critics were, on the whole, not yet familiar with Mozart's original Zauberflöte. The influential French critic Geoffroy, 1801, described the music as truly new, what purity of melody, what simplicity, what religious character, sombre and melancholic, unquote. The Courrier des Spectacles from 1801 remarked upon Mozartian qualities of melodiousness, rich expression, delicacy, refinement, well-distributed accompaniment parts, also commending Lachnith's care at arranging the score. For La Décade Philosophique in 1801, the music, quote, made people admire the real talent of Mozart with the finesse and grace, the melancholy and gaiety, and the accompaniments always in agreement with the character of the melody and the song, unquote. In the Gazette Nationale from 1801, the music conveyed lively enthusiasm, vigour, freshness, warmth, beauty, and originality. So very positive on the music. As I say, that is all like it changes very soon thereafter in the critical tradition. The costumes, staging, and dancing in Les Mystères were praised from the outset, with Ignazio de Gotti and Pierre-Gabriel Gardel, who were responsible for the decor and the ballet, respectively, enthusiastically commended for their work. For one critic in 1801, everything was delightful, and for another, spectacular and magnificent. In Act 4, quote, "The magic of the spectacle and the beauty of the decorations attracted the attention of the audience," unquote, and that's according to the Gazette Nationale from 1801. And the ballet in Act 4 was acknowledged as superb. For the Magazine Encyclopédique, 1801, quote, "The costumes have all the accuracy one could desire, and the decorations are of the greatest beauty, to which is added a perfect knowledge of Egyptian architecture," unquote. Experiencing the combination of the music and the production of Les Mystères, and on occasion the text as well, also elicited positive reactions. The charming music and the magnificence and magic of the decor contributed to the huge success of Les Mystères for the Courrier des Spectacles in 1801. The journal exclaimed furthermore, quote, "What purity of style and what imposing severity in the decorations, what richness in the costumes and what magnificence in the ballets. Everything captures the senses, everything commands attention. The music is one of the most beautiful we know," unquote. In the Petite Affiche from 1801, Grimaud de la Reynière believed that the mediocre libretto of Die Zauberflöte had been adapted by Morel in an effective organised way. Moreover, Les Mystères was the most beautiful spectacle witnessed at the opera, featuring charming dancing and de Gotti's magical and glorious decor. And Duménil, in the same journal, was a self-described admirer, pronouncing the opera, quote, "magnificent in that it unites the beauty of the music with the charm of the ballets, the decorations, all the prestige which distinguishes the first lyric theatre of Europe," the opera, in other words, unquote. For the Mercure de France in 1801, music, staging, and ballets were all remarkable. Numbers such as Zarastra's aria and the Act 3 choruses prove that Les Mystères had the required nobility to merit inclusion at the opera, and the production surpassed anything previously witnessed at this venue. Overall, quote, "It would perhaps be impossible to form elsewhere a spectacle which, by the perfection of several parts and the majesty of the whole, exercised more influence over the senses and the imagination," unquote. At revivals too, the music and the production were perceived to be mutually reinforcing. Time and again, in the first decade of Les Mystères' life, critics return admiringly to one moment in Act 2, Scene 7 of the opera that simultaneously brings together several aspects of the operatic experience to apparently charming effect. And this is when the chorus, Papageno, used his use of the magical instrument to tame and enchant the slaves who are about to capture him and Pamina. So this is, for those of you who know the magic flute, this is the passage Das klinget so herrlich, das klinget so schön from the Act 1 finale of Die Zauberflöte, immediately before Papageno and Pamina together sing Könnte jeder brave man, in which they express their wish that music could always exercise such power. For Geoffroy, the critic I mentioned earlier from 1801, music and dance together produced a prodigious effect. According to the Magazine Encyclopédique from 1801, the chorus, quote, "draws from his magical instrument the most harmonious sounds and enchants the guards and slaves, who dance while showing their admiration. This piece is of such great beauty, the dance follows so perfectly the chords of the harmonica and the harp, joined to the voice of François Leys, who's in the role of the chorus, the Papageno, that this piece was requested again and heard for the second time with the greatest enthusiasm." Unquote. The distinguished critic Johann Friedrich Reichardt, a German critic who intensely disliked Les Mystères, like many Germans, as I'll explain below, thought it was an exquisite moment, quote, "something completely perfect of its kind, such as one only sees in Paris. In short, quote, it is not possible to imagine anything more piquant and perfect in composition and performance. In such important and pleasant tableaux, Gardel, the dance master, has his real strength and knows how to draw from the situation and the personnel every time. The repetition of this unique scene was generally requested and given with the same love and perfection as the first time," unquote. For the Journal des Débats from 1808, quote, "We do not see every day a scene such as that of the delightful Ethiopians, transported by the charms of harmony, falling at the feet of the musician. This situation so well placed at the opera produces the most piquant effect," unquote. After such a positive start to its French reception, the critical tide began to turn for Les Mystères in the second and third decades of the 19th century. Two articles capture the change. One in the Journal de Lyon from 1814, these are mentioned on the PowerPoint, and another by the famous French critic Castelblas in De l'Opéra en France from 1820. For the Journal de Lyon, Mozart's skills as a dramatist required attention rather than Mozart as just a musician. Expertly tuned to sequences of numbers and progressions of emotions in his opera, we're told, Mozart demonstrated highly refined and distinctive dramatic sensibilities. According to this journal, this is precisely what was lost in Les Mystères, the reordering of numbers from Die Zauberflöte or material interpolated from other operas, compromise dramatic integrity. In effect, the French public were to blame for a work like Les Mystères, we're told, this is what by the Journal de Lyon, as they considered Mozart a musician, the French public did, and were only vaguely interested in his dramatic perspectives, predilections, and achievements. Castelblas from 1820 also could not stomach all of the adjustments, additions, and cuts to the original Zauberflöte in Les Mystères, and found the reordering of material unconscionable. He admitted special sensitivity to Mozart's music in this respect, since he knew it so well. He accepted that original versions of the operas often needed adjustments before performances in France, but favoured carefully cutting numbers rather than engaging in what he considered more invasive practices. While Castelblas accepted that works in bad taste, such as Les Mystères, would continue to be published, he was baffled at this opera being staged at the very best theatre in France. Subsequent French critics either expressed surprise at the popular success of Les Mystères or erroneously denied it had ever been popular in the first place. An entry on Morel in the Biographie Nouvelle from 1824, presenting him as an untalented parodist and populist, claimed that the triumph of the parody had never been, quote, more surprising and more complete than in Les Mystères, a work conceived and written in spite of common sense, unquote. M.A. de la Forest from 1823, claiming that no pasticcio could ever be successful in France, talked of, quote, the repugnance which Les Mystères has always inspired in the public. It is a masterpiece in stupidity, unquote. He stated that, quote, after all the tests undergone by this insipid work, it's not easy to realise the motives that could have made the administration at the Opera decide to take up Les Mystères again in 1823, unquote. Put simply, de la Forest harnessed an imagined interpretation of the musical public's perpetually negative reactions to Les Mystères. It's a fiction because it wasn't unpopular, incredibly popular. So he harnessed this idea of perpetual negativity to his own perception of the weaknesses of the work. Thus, we witness in French writings from the second and third decades of the 19th century a wedge driven between popular and critical opinion of Les Mystères. It's true that the popular appeal of Les Mystères may not have been as intense in the later part of its 26 years on the boards of the Opera than in its earlier parts. There are fewer performances, for example, in that latter period, and the spectacle may have diminished a little too. The 1816 revival, for example, of Les Mystères was reduced from 4 acts to 3, with several numbers from the earlier Mystères omitted, and the entire fire and water trials as well. It was said that Morel, who died in 1814 and who was a great proponent of the fine decor at the opera, would not have approved. We might expect a reduction in the performance count across a protracted period, though, and substantial receipts continued to be taken at each rendition of Les Mystères from 1816 onwards. In Germanic reception of Les Mystères, the contrast between public enthusiasm and critical negativity was present from the outset, since critical opinion, no doubt inflected by experiences of Die Zauberflöte in German and greater general knowledge of Mozart's music than in France, was consistently low. Yet German critics in at least the first decade of the 19th century neither denied nor downplayed French public approbation, and often referenced the high quality of the production. The Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung then, 1801, leading German journal in music, issued a damning indictment of the music and text, but admitted the seductive power of individual performers, such as Les as Chorus, and of the enchanting ballets that combine music and dance in remarkable ways. The Zeitung für die elegante Welt, 1801, reported Les Mystères as shallow and heartless and in possession of a dreadful libretto, but acknowledged that brilliant costumes, picturesque decorations, and Gardel's ballets would ensure large attendances for a long time to come. Carl Julius Weber from 1806 found Mozart's music mutilated almost beyond recognition, but the production completely enchanting. Waxing lyrical about the decorations and stage machinery, he explained that, quote, in an instant, all the metamorphosis in the scenery took place, the clothing was selected, and was mainly the most accurate Egyptian costume, which even the strictest antiquarian would not have been able to criticize. The trade-off for Weber then was explicit, quote, the pleasure that the eye derives from the splendor and magnificence of the decorations, dances, and costumes must compensate for any deprivation or mistreatment of the ear, unquote. At around the time French critics distanced themselves from the public popularity of Les Mystères, though, German critics began to do the same. The Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung 1812 was simply annoyed and irritated by the latest Mystère revival and in no mood to reference its continued popularity. With outrageous cuts, additions, and other changes, quote, it drags its way to the end with lame legs, unquote, and its characters are, quote, like noble statues whose limbs have been cut off and reattached, colourful robes painted on, but above all, red cheeks and coarse moustaches smeared on, unquote. For Ernst Ludwig Gerber, who makes no attempt to distinguish between critics and the general musical public, the patchwork of Les Mystères did not please a great deal and became known by the nickname that actually is referenced quite a lot, Les Misères d'ici, so the miseries of today, as it were, rather than Les Mystères d'ici. So just, as I say, a very impolite nickname, which is referenced all the time in critical literature because, of course, nobody likes the work anymore. The shift in critical emphasis from the second decade of the 19th century onwards is attributed to two simultaneously occurring temporal factors. The intricate context around the genesis and production of Les Mystères fading into the distance, and the historical circumstances evolving. Now, this is a quote from the original Les Mystères production, and I think it's from 1802. Quote, what is the importance of investigating whether Mozart's chords contributed less to the audience's approbation than the talents of the decorator and the prestige of the stagehand, unquote. And that's what the Mercure de France asked rhetorically in 1802. But a little over a decade later, production values were less significant to critics, and identifying misrepresentations of Mozart, the musician and dramatist, took center stage. In turn, this set the scene for the frequently vitriolic attacks on Les Mystères in the ensuing 200 years, when Les Mystères was temporarily still further removed from an original context that was invariably of very little interest to critics in any case. Mozart's reputation grew exponentially in the first 2 decades or so of the 19th century, in France as elsewhere. For some critics, then, any parody at all will have seemed inadequate when the composer in question was qualitatively supreme in their breadth of talent and achievement, that's from 1805, and in their status as a demigod, that's a quote from Momigny in 1818. Extreme musical popularity, however, even when short-lived, can tell important stories. Morel and Lackneath worked within a constrained set of political, cultural, and musical circumstances, from introducing Mozart's music to Paris and meeting expectations of the opera audience to pleasing Napoleon and his retinue. Consequently, they would have had limited opportunity or need to focus narrowly on music and drama, and every reason to consider the holistic impact of their endeavour, including musical, dramatic, extra-musical, and production elements on their different audiences, exalted ones and less exalted ones alike. It still may be fair for us subsequently to condemn them for musical and dramatic failings in areas that they themselves did not prioritise. Irrespective, we must account for the landmark status of Les Mystères in the history of Mozart in France, when re-examining the context and reception of the work. Okay, just a conclusion now. Les Mystères, d'ici, and 19th century French critical reception of Mozart. The year 1801 proved a crucial launching pad for the reception of Mozart in France, with the stratospheric popularity of Les Mystères right at its core. 2 influential books by Theodor Winkler and C.F. Kramer, mentioned up there, both published in the wake of Les Mystères' initial success in 1801 and derived from seminal German writings, referenced the opera and in turn stimulated further French biographical interest in Mozart. Winkler's Notice biographique sur Mozart, 1801, took almost all of its text from Friedrich Schlichtergroll's 6,000-word German obituary of Mozart, which is itself the first authentic biography of Mozart. In Winkler's second paragraph, before presenting the material derived from Schlichtergroll, he acknowledged the attention to Mozart wrought by Les Mystères, thereby establishing it as the de facto entry point for his biography. In the best traditions of early biography, the message is clear. If we admire Mozart's music, in this case through Les Mystères, we will also want to know about his life. Kramer, translating Johann Friedrich Rochlitter's famous or infamous Mozart anecdotes, originally published in the Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung in 1798, includes a lengthy interpolation on Les Mystères. Acknowledging disquiet about the license Morel and Lachneath took, he also defends Les Mystères on the grounds of Schikaneder's original libretto itself being problematic. If we are to reproach Morel and Lachneath, Kramer claims, it should be because they, quote, took too much trouble to bring this opera closer to the noble genre, to the detriment of this variety and variegation of tones which reigns in the original, unquote. Kramer believes we also need to remember the compromises Morel and Lachneath had to make in order to render Mozart's opera performable in a French theatre. Winkler and Kramer circulated widely in the early 19th century in their original forms and through republication. Winkler also became the primary source for Stendhal's important, much-read biography in French of Mozart from 1814. With Les Mystères at the helm, Winkler, Kramer and Morel and Lachneath's opera together ignited 19th century French reception of Mozart. The impact of Les Mystères in France also manifests itself beyond its association with two key French Mozart texts. Accounting for the French premiere of Don Giovanni as Don Juan in 1805, the Archives littéraires d'Europe, 1805, claimed surely justifiably that, quote, the success of Les Mystères d'Isis prompted the opera administration to make us enjoy another work by Mozart, unquote. When Die Zauberflöte finally received its Parisian premiere in German in 1829, it included an aria for Tamino taken from Die Entführung aus dem Serail. So the cross-fertilization of Zauberflöte with Mozart's other operas, initiated in Les Mystères, thereby continued, albeit in a much less prominent way. The influence of Les Mystères also persists in the French translation La Flûte Enchantée by Charles Ritter and Adolphe Beaumont from 1865, as gauged by dissimilarities with Mozart and Schikaneder's Zauberflöte and connections to Les Mystères instead. The Masonic elements and emphasis on religious mysteries are downplayed. The partnership between Tamino and Pamina is established before the opera is started rather than during it in Zauberflöte. And the end, quote, marks a closing in on the married couple celebrated by Isis, not an opening up to the harmony of all men and women to the greater good of civic morality, unquote. That's from a recent book that deals with Freemasonry and touches on magic flute and Les Mystères. In 1824, Morel's text is a cultural reference point at the beginning of the second of two volumes devoted to Jean Maillotte, a legendary tavern owner in 16th century Lille who helped quell Protestant rebels. The author, de Foucault-Compré, quotes a passage from Les Mystères about the sweet power of harmony residing with the gods and subjecting everyone to its persuasive charms. The text immediately follows the aforementioned moment, popular with French audiences, when the chorus enchants the ominously aggressive slaves with his magical instrument, the one I mentioned earlier. Even in the mid-19th century, French publications continued to refer to Les Mystères as the primary reference point for the music from Die Zauberflöte, capturing in microcosm the opera's protracted presence in French musical culture. In conjunction with both its impact in France and its troubled critical reception, Les Mystères offers a salutary reminder of the power that publicly popular events and works have to influence reception-related activity. The great Mozart biographer Otto Jahn, mid-19th century, establishing legitimate and illegitimate lines of Mozart work in the 60 years or so between Mozart's death and the publication of his biography, would have assigned Les Mystères to the latter category, with the category of illegitimate, as it were. He clarifies his disapproval of it in any case, as I quoted earlier. Yet Les Mystères unlocks the door to French Mozart reception, achieving a previously unimagined level of popularity for Mozart. It also acts as progenitor to an adventurous kind of French Mozart reception that we cannot really characterize. Like Les Mystères, with Morel's and Lachneath's alterations, omissions, and substitutions, many of the most interesting landmarks of 19th century Mozart reception in France do not concern Mozart alone or involve the modification or completion of his music. The Requiem, for example, is a case in point. It's brilliant, high-profile French premiere at the hands of Luigi Cherubini in 1804 is scarcely imaginable without the popular success of Les Mystères 3 years earlier, and it could never be the Requiem about Mozart alone. It was incomplete at Mozart's death, of course, and performed in a version completed by his associate Franz Xaver Zussmayer, whether this is known by the audience or not. Moreover, the performance of Mozart's Requiem at Napoleon's reinterment at Les Invalides on the 15th of December 1840 was probably the single most important act of French 19th century Mozart reception, precisely because it transcended association with Mozart alone. The spirit of the revered honoree, Napoleon, the commemorative occasion, Mozart's music, the seductive legend around his Requiem, and the superb performers under the great French conductor François Habeneck come together powerfully to create a remarkable musical experience documented by contemporary critics. Fittingly, it received a repeated, similarly acclaimed performance as the following year at the Opéra, scene of Les Mystères, landmark triumph 40 years earlier. Thus, with reception history properly factored into the equation, we should not regard Morel and Lachneath as villains who supposedly mutilate and ultimately assassinate Mozart for their own purposes. Lachneath was castigated once for emotionally claiming to one of his neighbours at a performance of Les Mystères, quote, "It's over. I don't want to do any more opera. I would never compose one superior to this," unquote. Irrespective of how we interpret the issue of his authorship in Les Mystères, he would surely have had cause to reflect on the famous maxim, vox populi, vox Dei, the voice of the people is the voice of God. Where Mozart reception in France is concerned, Lachneath and Morel can lay claim to be heroes, by virtue of their huge popular success, not remotely experienced before by Mozart in France, and perhaps not by any German opera in France at that time either. They set the stage for all that was to follow for Mozart in Francophone musical cultures, in popular and serious domains alike. Many thanks.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. This certainly must have taken a very painstaking research. We might have a few minutes for questions, and I'll abuse my position to be the first one to ask something.
Of course. Yeah.
This change in the critical attitude towards the Mystère, was it some kind of about-face, abruptly change, or there were some intermediate stages of less favorable but not so scathing criticism?
Yes, I mean, I've simplified to some extent, although, yes, there's clearly a change sort of around about the beginning of the second decade of the 19th century. So you have a kind of, and it probably relates to when revivals happen. So, I mean, the list of performances, all 128 of them between 1801 and 1827 is quite uneven. A lot in 1801, then few in 1802, then there's a bit of a gap, and then a lot more in 1804, etc. So there seems to have been a key revival around about 1812, and that may be when the critical negativity begins to set in, for precisely the reasons that I'm mentioning. You know what? Something I didn't really talk about, but I think what really irks critics from particularly kind of the early 19th century onwards and way into the 20th century as well, is the fact that it was so popular. As I say, some people are trying to deny that, and that's itself very interesting because that's absolutely nonsensical. Berlioz, to his credit, doesn't deny it, but says, how can it have happened? Others try to say, well, Elect 4 or whatever, it was never really there in the first place, which is nonsense. So there's this kind of sense that there's this kind of anger towards it, and that came out in a review I briefly mentioned from the Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung, where they're so irritated by the fact it's coming back at all, they don't really want to say very much about it. And it's that level of kind of dismissal that then I think anchors itself in the critical tradition, and that then becomes unmovable even to this day. I mean, I found one, it's available on YouTube actually, and one kind of recent revival of Les Mystères, but that's it, from about 2016, 2017, something like that. But there's nothing really anymore, and it's as it were, it's simply ignored. It's faded into the distance. And as I say, we lose something as a result of that, as well as, of course, it sounds, you listen to it, and it's very odd. For those of us who know magic flute as well as I do, And probably for people who don't know it terribly well, it is very strange. The reordering, the bits of music from other operas. You get Fin Candelvino, the famous Don Giovanni aria, and he brings that into Les Mystères, and he makes it into a trio. So it's not Don Giovanni singing it, or even a single singer. Of course, it's not Don Giovanni, but not a single singer. It's three singers. So it sounds incredibly odd to
one would always say something like a precursor of postmodernism.
Yeah, in a way, it ought to be. In fact, that's personal. I mean, you say that with levity, Miloš, but in fact, that's quite right. There should be a sense, actually, in which a work like Les Mystères is now interrogated, which I haven't done because I'm more interested in its reception than actually looking at it and saying what I think is good or not so good about it. But yes, it should be open to interpretation in a kind of postmodern world as well. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Other questions?
Labai įdomu, bet aš noriu paklausti...
Hang on a minute, I need to get my transport conditions. Yeah, great, thanks.
Apie 21 amžiaus Mozarto pastatymo tendencijas, už ką jūs. Dabar yra toks, žinot, režy teatr, režy opera, tokia kryptis.
21st age Mozart staging preferences. And for instance, režy age.
Pavyzdys yra Pagrobimo iš Seralio pastatymas Berlyne 2004 metais. Režisierius Beitas iš Ispanijos susirinko Berlyne prostitutės, pasamdė prostitutės, pastatė labai vulgariai, labai erotiškai, kad choras atsisakė dalyvauti šitame pastatyme, o generaliniai repeticijoje atsisakė ir orkestras. Ir po to ieškojo tokio kompromiso.
I've got a few of those words, but bizarrely, but probably not the ones that will have
the whore refused to participate in the inscenization because it was too vulgar, including prostitutes, and too much erotic. And how do you can interpret this?
How do I interpret that relative to Les Mystères, do you mean, or just in general?
Yra dvi pozicijos, kad užtenka tų realesnių pastatymų, pastatymas turi kalbėti ir apie dabartį. Ir čia yra dvi pozicijos, kaip yra su Mozartu, ir jūsų pozicija, ką jūs manote apie tai? Ačiū.
And there are two views, let's go. One is kind of classical and
realistic.
Okay, realistic.
Contemporary.
One is realistic.
Yeah.
In terms that it's more classical one.
Yeah.
And another contemporary.
Yeah.
What should attract the
today?
People?
Yes. Well, do you mean today then? Yeah. Okay.
What is your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting. I mean, what should attract people today for Les Mystères? Yeah, well, okay. So, well, I think there are many ways of answering that. One, I suppose, from a Mozartian perspective, one thinks about the fact that so much of Mozart as processed in the 19th century was, in effect, not really Mozart. So what I'm talking about with Les Mystères in terms of opera and adaptation is an extreme version of what's going on right across the board. So I think there's a kind of historical interest from a classical perspective, from an opera perspective in general. So Mozart, 18th century opera, then broadens into a kind of sense of reception of opera in general in the 19th century. But then partly what we were sort of semi-joking about with Miloš is there is a kind of sense that if you understand opera as kind of, in some senses, transgressive, potentially provocative in all kinds of ways, yes, maybe classical, maybe not, then Les Mystères certainly has something to tell us all about how operas establish themselves, how they're interesting, why they're interesting. I mean, in a way, the irony about what you're saying is that, in fact, in some ways, Les Mystères was itself conceived of clearly as a classical kind of production, in that it's creating these parallels between Napoleonic France and ancient Egypt. So the great of the current time is reflected, the greats of the ancient Egyptians is then being reflected in great activity of Napoleonic France, etc. So there's a sense in which they're trying to classicize their opera right at the beginning, although that's certainly not how we would understand it now. So I think it's potentially a fascinating work to have reimagined, because it challenges us to put ourselves in a kind of early 19th century perspective in listening to Mozart, rather than our kind of sort of perspective that we have now. I'm not saying it's better or worse, I'm saying that re-interrogating and re-looking back at something from so long ago is always a really kind of interesting endeavor. Thank you.
Well, perhaps one more brief question.
And a brief answer, I hope.
Thank you for... Thank you for your presentation. My question is about symbolical meanings. Could you see some changes in the interpretation of Egyptian surroundings and pyramids particularly?
Yes, I mean, that's a really good question. I will have to look into that. I will have to look into that more. I don't know whether Morel, I mean, my hunch is, that's a really good question, but my hunch is that that wasn't a concern for Morel specifically. The issue at the Opera was to build on something that would be stupendously popular. The intricacies of how specific Egyptian imagery worked, I think, was of less concern to Morel. That's my reaction, but I would have to look into that more in terms of kind of contextualizing Morel himself in greater detail. Yes, certainly. I mean, I mentioned one or two writings that Morel obviously knew and drew upon, and again, the exact relationship between those and his production would be something that one could go into in more detail. As I say, my interest is more from the perspective of reception and why this work is so denigrated, or has been over the last 200 years, but was so loved, at least in France, for the first 10. But exactly what was on Morel's mind is again something that I think probably requires more investigation.
Well, okay, let's thank Simon once again.